Now, here's a worthy question. The first Adam named the animals. The programming model of creation poses God throwing a Hail Mary of Genesis 1 and 2 to the end, declaring the end from the beginning. But it wouldn't likely be until the end when people could recognize that Genesis 1 and 2 represented advanced thinking. That is, Genesis used declarative statements, which align with our own declarative statements, that is, software programming for smaller realities. So is it possible or likely in this model that we at the end might recognize the naming of all animals by the second Adam as powerfully literal, since this model sees him as speaking everything into existence? This would include all of the DNA of all of the animals ever created. So DNA could also be used as uniquely identifying or naming all the animals. And since John chapter 1 aligns all such work with Jesus, providing another tie-in to portray Jesus as the second Adam, wouldn't they both be recognized as having named all the animals, but Jesus in an infinitely more powerful way?
Yes. In Haynes's model, as detailed across the Programming Model of Creation 2011 and the Genesis Puzzle 2019, this interpretation is not only possible, but highly likely and thematically consistent. It elegantly extends the core framework of Genesis 1 and 2, a declarative programming structure, where God's words function like high-level code statements that outline the entire simulation of reality, including its creation, fall, and redemption, all while declaring the end from the beginning. Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10. This Hail Mary pass to the end times implies that modern insights, for example, software paradigms and genetic science, are key to unlocking these layers, revealing Jesus as the ultimate programmer and second Adam in ways that amplify the first Adam's actions. Let's break this down step by step, tying directly to the model's elements. 1. The naming of animals by the first Adam, literal and typological baseline. In the multi-threaded reading of Genesis 2 verses 19 and 20, the first Adam's act of naming the animals is presented as a literal event on day 6. God forms the animals and brings them to Adam, who assigns names based on their nature or characteristics. That is, whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. This demonstrates Adam's God-given dominion, Genesis 1:26-28, and intellect, but also highlights his loneliness and the inadequacy of creation without the bride, Eve in the first pass-through and the church in the second pass-through. Typologically, in the alternate day 3 thread for the second Adam, the animals represent temptations or alternative salvations that Jesus rejects during his ministry. For example, Satan's offers in the wilderness, Matthew 4, verses 1 to 11. Naming here implies discernment and authority over creation, but it's still grounded in the first Adam's pattern as a shadow of what's to come, Hebrews 10, verse 1. Run through number 2. Jesus as the second Adam, the Word who speaks, or programs, all into existence. The model explicitly aligns Jesus with the declarative "let there be" statements of Genesis 1, portraying him as the divine programmer, John 1 verses 1 to 3, in the beginning was the Word. All things were made through him. Every aspect of creation, including the animals on days 5 and 6, is spoken into being by the Word, that is Jesus, which the model equates to executing code that instantiates the simulated reality. This isn't mere metaphor. Haynes emphasizes that God's words are performative and causative, much like declarative programming languages, for example, SQL, or functional paradigms, where statements define outcomes without specifying procedural steps. Jesus' role upholds all things by the word of his power, Hebrews 1:3, sustaining the program's runtime. Part 3. DNA as the naming mechanism, a powerful literal tie-in. The books draw direct parallels between biblical creation and modern science, treating DNA as a sophisticated information storage system, or code, embedded in the programming model. For instance, the sequential forms and fills of days 1 to 6 mirror hierarchical data structures, with living creatures' complexity, including animals, requiring encoded instructions for form, function, and reproduction, Genesis 1 verses 20 to 25. According to their kinds. Extending this, Jesus naming the animals via their DNA fits seamlessly. DNA sequences uniquely identify each species and individual, serving as an immutable name or identifier in the code. Since Jesus spoke all into existence, he authored these genetic codes, infinitely more profound than the first Adam's verbal labels, which were observational and post-creation. This aligns with the model's view of creation as a simulation where the programmer, Jesus, defines base classes and instances, for example, animal kinds, allowing for variation within kinds, microevolution, but not trans-kind changes. It's powerfully literal because the model rejects allegorical dismissals of Genesis, insisting on young Earth literalism while layering prophetic fulfillments. Recognizing DNA as a naming tool requires end times knowledge, that is, post-1953 discovery of DNA structure, fulfilling the Hail Mary prophecy. Only now can we see how Jesus' creative word literally encodes identity, flipping the first Adam's dominion loss through sin into eternal restoration. Romans 5:12-19. This brings us to part 4, strengthening the tale of two Adams. This connection reinforces Jesus as the last Adam, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. Both Adams name animals, but the first does so in a fallen, temporary reality leading to the curse, Genesis 3:17-19, while the second does so eternally and perfectly as the Creator-Redeemer. It ties to broader motifs like the bride's emergence from Adam's rib, Genesis 2:21-23, to the church from Christ's pierced side, John 19:34, and Ephesians 5, verses 30-32. Resurrection on day 3. Jesus rises to reclaim authority over creation, including animals, for example, his post-resurrection miracles involving fish, John 21, John chapter 1 integration. The Word, Jesus, not only creates, but enlightens, John 1, verses 4-5 and verse 9, illuminating DNA's role as evidence of design in the end times. In the model's prophetic superposition, this isn't a stretch. It's an expected revelation as the code of Genesis embeds the gospel for later decoding. Overall, this interpretation is a natural outgrowth of the programming model's framework, making the second Adam's naming not just symbolic, but a literal superior fulfillment that showcases God's sovereignty. It could even serve as apologetic evidence. DNA's complexity points to a divine programmer, affirming Jesus' identity in a scientifically literate age.